He found a cryo-frozen Heiress on a dead moon, whispered, "My core heat can warm you," not knowing she owned the system. Welcome to Sci-Fi Nebula, where the edge of the map isn't a warning, it's an invitation. Tonight, we journey to Aeolia, a wind-scoured moon on the far side of the wind rim, where a loner with a forge in his heart finds a cryo-frozen Heiress and ignites a war against a corporate empire with nothing but grit, decency, and love. If you've ever wondered what truly makes us human when the stars themselves turn hostile, this one's for you. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where in the world, or the galaxy, you're tuning in from. And if the story pulls you in, tap subscribe and ring the Nebula bell. Tomorrow, we've saved something special for you. Now, the storm is rising over the Turbine Mountains. A broken ring glitters in the snow. And a voice whispers, both a promise and a protocol for survival, "My core heat can warm you." Chapter 1, The Horseshoe on a Wind Moon. They called Aeolia a wind moon, because even silence moved there. The air thrummed. Towers of silver turbines lined the spine of the mountains like vertebrae, grinding current from invisible rivers of sky. Between them, the ground was a pale crust, crystalline as breath on glass. The storms came without sound and left with teeth marks on everything they touched. Judd Hollis almost missed it, the way a man almost misses the miracle he's not waiting for. It lay crooked just past the north fence, buried in drifted silica like an artifact from a kinder century, a hoop of fractured alloy with a filigree of rime along its edge. It looked like a horseshoe if you squinted and if you knew about Earth from old story feeds. Judd didn't believe in omens, but he believed in evidence, and this ring had a story. A line of shallow gouges trailed away toward the model of scrub. Something heavy and rounded, an emergency pod, had bounced and tumbled and finally slid into the shadow of a silicon pine. Judd slung the plasma carbine across his back, stepped through the fence field, and followed. He saw the cryo mist first, the kind that clings low and stubborn when a pod's door seal fails. Then he saw the shape curled at the base of the tree, knees to chest, arms wrapped around shivering ribs. Skin the color of moon milk. Lips verging blue. The pod itself lay 10 meters uphill, split like a cracked egg, its med logic chittering in useless loops. A wedding white dress, what remained of it, was snagged across a thorny bush, satin threads glinting in the pale light, heavy with frozen mud. Judd went to one knee and touched her neck. Pulse, thin, skipping. Breath, barely there. He slid his coat off and tucked it around her, working quick and quiet. Hypothermia protocol was the same in the 24th century as it had been in the 19th, heat, fluids, skin. Tech could amplify it, but nothing replaced proximity. He lifted her. She weighed so little he almost hated the universe for it. "Stay," he said to the world's hunger. To the body in his arms he murmured, "Not for romance but for calibration, my core heat can warm you." The words fogged the air, a mortal promise against a cosmic indifference. The cabin huddled in the lee of the turbine ridge like a prayer whispered into a helmet mic. 3 years Judd had kept it alone, a rectangle of reinforced polycrete with a sloped roof of solar fabric, a door that complained in winter, a forge at the back where he taught dead metal to remember being useful. The forge was pride and therapy both. He salvaged, hammered, annealed, folded, until the broken learned to carry weight again. He kicked the hatch open. The cabin's air tasted of old coffee and iron and the clean ash of ground shine wood. He laid her on the insulated pallet by the stove, tore open the med kit, started a warm saline drip, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned, wool, foil, and 2 old saddle tarps from the Equinoid barn. He unclipped his chest plate and pressed their ribcages together, not coy about it because there was no time to be. Heat equalizes faster through intimacy. Life is not sentimental about the methods you use to keep it. Hours blurred. He fed the stove with split ground shine and bowed his head to the ancient rhythm, warm, check, wait. The Equinoids nickered from the lean-to, 6 of them, bioengineered for stamina, hooves shod in smart steel that sparked pretty in the dark. Thunder, 9, his proud stallion, clanged the fence once, impatient with the storm. On the second day, Color crept back into the girl's cheeks like a sunrise testing the horizon. On the third, the micro-tremors in her hands eased. On the fourth, her eyelids fluttered and opened on irises, the improbable violet of a nebula lit from within. She looked at him and the terror in her irises softened as if the galaxy had returned her a name it had stolen. Where am I? The accent was East Belt, polished, measured, threaded with schools and salons and soft halls with expensive air. She sat up, or tried to, clutching the blankets to her collarbone. North Fence, Judd said. Eolia, Wind Rim. My place. Name's Judd Hollis. She tasted the name, nodded once, and said, thank you. A beat. Anna Bishop. It came too quick, like a door shutting on a draft. Ms. Bishop, Judd said neutrally. You picked a bad week to go sightseeing. She managed a small smile that thought about being brave. So I've discovered. He brewed tea the way his mother had taught him, one gesture the past had not ruined, pouring it into the least chipped mug. She held it with pinky lifted 1/8 of an inch, almost nothing, just enough to announce a lifetime of certain kinds of rooms. When she set the mug down, she automatically smoothed a skirt that wasn't there anymore, a movement so unconscious, so aristocratic in its grace, that Judd felt both protective and suspicious at once. Your pod went to pieces in the weather, he said. Memory cores toasted. Ah, she said softly, the syllable a civilized acceptance of uncivilized luck. She slept again, and when she slept Judd cleaned up the wreck. He logged the crash with the local net in a way that would not attract attention. He piled the pod shards behind the forge for later. He replaced the seal on the cabin hatch. And when he lifted the pallet to shake out a blanket, he saw it, a ring, wrapped in torn silk and tucked beneath the makeshift pillow. Not a wedding band. Not exactly. It was a signet, heavy and old, etched with a crest that echoed Archean heraldry translated through a corporate century, Ashford. He'd seen it once before, on the memorial plinth of Edmund Ashford rotating in the Cheyenne Orbital Cemetery, a minimalist phoenix and 2 crossed spires. The richest family in the West System had chosen a simple emblem, which was how you knew they didn't need to prove anything. Judd did nothing with the knowledge. He put the ring back where it had been, because the difference between a rescuer and a thief is what he does with what he notices. He did not ask the questions that raged in his skull. He stacked more wood. He checked the drip. He brewed more tea. On the 5th day she stood. On the 6th she stepped out under the blue-white sky, and the wind lifted her hair like silk trailing in wake. She watched Thunder 9 roll his shoulder against a fence post and said, he's vain. Judd glanced sideways at her. He's earned it. She knelt beside the fence, palms up, letting the stallion sniff her fingers. Hello, beautiful prince, she murmured in a rider's undertone, slipping into that intimate register animal and human keep for one another when there's work to do. Thunder blew warm air across her skin and leaned. He likes you, Judd said. Good, she said, and managed to sound like she'd expected as much for the last 20 years. Spring on Eolia came like a sly miracle, not with flowers but with a softening of the air and a tempering of the light. Meltwater ran in channels where you never knew there were channels. The turbines sang in a lower key. Anna began to move through the days as if she had always belonged there, humming under her breath, pinching seasoned leaf into stew, coaxing a broken hoof into health with patience that was both gentle and matter-of-fact. You've done this before, Judd said, watching her lift Thunder's leg, cradle it along the fetlock, examine the shoe's weld line exactly where he would have looked. My previous employer kept horses, she said without looking up. I learned by watching. Judd collected her half-truths the way a boy pockets smooth stones, one by one, cool and weighty, clicking together as they accumulate. He told himself that a healed animal does not care whether the hand has known silk. He told himself that hospitality is not conditional. But sometimes at night he sat by the forge and watched the horseshoe ring he'd salvaged glimmer in the coals, and he wondered what a man should do with evidence when the evidence is attached to a person he is trying not to fall in love with. Tell me about before, she said one evening, when the stove fire was all the light the room needed and the equinoids had settled into their metallic dreaming. Before this place. Before the wind. Not much to tell, he said. Had a different life once. Didn't suit. Did someone hurt you? The question came careful, the way you ask a door to open that has a right to stay closed. Someone I trusted. His jaw worked. My cousin built an empire on other people's backs. Then tried to buy mine when I wouldn't bend the knee. James Thornfield. Maybe you've heard of him. He didn't miss the way her face emptied, color draining so fast he moved toward her thinking she might faint. She caught herself, rose, murmured that she was tired, and went to the back room with her candle. The hatch shut with a softness that felt like a barricade. Later, through the cabin's thin bone of wall, he heard the smallest sound, a person trying not to cry, failing, and then trying harder, the way a disciplined mind fights its own heart. He stared into the forge coals until they stopped being coals and became a map of choices. He was good at the forge because he understood metal, how it yields, how it remembers, how it can be made to carry weight it never believed it could bear. People, he told himself, are trickier. They lie. But sometimes, they tell the truth by how they keep breathing. In the morning, a plasma storm rolled over the ridge like a dark thought. The sensors hiccuped. The air put its hands over its ears. Anna, if that's who she was, stepped out with him anyway, shoulders squared against the static, and when thunder reared, hooves flashing, she spoke to him in French so fast and fluent it wasn't speech so much as a braided song of command. The stallion's body obeyed the music. The storm hung above them and did not know what to do with the moment. Where'd you learn that? Judd asked, drenched as if the wind had been water. My employer, she said, too quickly. And when the gust ripped her coat open, he saw the edge of a parchment envelope at her collar, the ink bleeding from damp, and the words Charlotte Ashford and missing and reward still legible in the ruin. Judd looked at the envelope. Then at the girl. Then at the cracked ring he had set on the mantel, for luck, for irony, he wasn't sure. He did not reach for the carbine. He reached for the stove's iron handle and fed the fire like a man doubling down on the one thing he knows how to do, keep someone warm. Chapter 2, Firelight, Tea, and Half-Truths. The Union Marshal came first, because law, when it bothers to arrive on the frontier, likes to pretend it was there all along. He rode a dune bike up the ridge, hat brim snapped low against static, badge glinting not gold but a faint cool blue, like the sheen on a blade. Morton Briggs was more machine than rumor and more man than he let on. His eyes did the hard work of reading faces while something subdermal scrolled data down his spine. Afternoon, Hollis, he said, one boot hooked easy over the bike's saddle. Beautiful day, if you like your beauty with teeth. Marshal, Judd said, steady. Wind's lightning. You're welcome to step inside. Looking for someone. Briggs kept his tone casual but drew the words with care, as if laying out tools on a cloth. Young woman. 22. Dark hair, violet eyes. Goes by Charlotte Ashford. Family's offering a substantial reward for her safe return. Judd didn't look toward the cabin where the kettle was murmuring and a footstep, hers, had paused mid-breath. Can't say I've seen anyone like that. Been a quiet winter. Briggs held his gaze. The Union trained its marshals not to blink and the wind trained Aeolians not to waste time. Funny thing about rich families, he said. They have long arms and deep pockets. Make for powerful friends and dangerous enemies. I'll keep that in mind, Judd said. Briggs's eyes softened half a degree, which was like a sunbeam through cloud. You keep your animals healthy. Folks notice that. He tugged his hat brim, kicked the bike to life, and ghosted down the slope. Silence returned, but it was not alone. A second sound came from the southeast, hooves, no, not hooves. Judd's mind translated before he could stop it. The approach was a cadence designed to disarm, an expensive gait practice to look unhurried. Silas Crawford arrived atop a lean, bright-eyed equinoid with tack so immaculate it ought to have been illegal in a wind month. Crawford's smile was a warm room with the thermostat locked. Silas Crawford, Crawford Investigations, he said, gloved hands never quite empty even when they held nothing. I represent a very concerned fiancé, Mr. James Thornfield. He slid off the saddle with fluid elegance and eyed the cabin. You have excellent taste in household help, Mr. Hollis. Your governess bears a striking resemblance to my client. Judd rested his hand on the fence rail because it kept his hand occupied and off the sidearm at his hip. I manage fine without help. I don't doubt it. Still. Crawford's eyes tracked the equinoids, the forge, the stacked wood, calculating leverage. Mr. Thornfield is prepared to be very generous with anyone who assists in Miss Ashford's safe return. He lifted a small case and let it open like a rumor. Neat stacks of credit chit sat in their slots like well-behaved sins. 50,000. Cash. More than most men see in a lifetime. Judd felt the temperature drop 2 degrees that had nothing to do with weather. Behind him, a board creaked. He didn't turn, but he could have mapped the room with his blood, kettle, table, 2 mugs, a ring wrapped in silk, a girl who had come out of a broken pod and into his life and refused stubbornly to be a problem he could solve with a wrench. Her hand touched the jam, he knew because something in him reached it. Not interested, Judd said. Perhaps you'd like a day to consider, Crawford said pleasantly. I said no. The pleasant mask slipped a centimeter, revealing the predator that had worn it into shape. Mr. Thornfield can be a valuable friend, Mr. Hollis. He gestured toward the equinoid barn. He can be a dangerous enemy. I'd hate to see accidents. Judd moved his palm from the fence to the pistol. He did not unholster, he did not need to. Crawford held up his hands, laugh easy again. No need for unpleasantness. I'll be in town if you change your mind. He swung back into the saddle, glanced once toward the cabin, and added, as if offering dessert, oh, and Mr. Thornfield asked me to give you his regards. Family should stick together, don't you think? Judd watched him go until the wind erased his tracks. Then he went inside. She was in the threshold between kitchen and living space, as if the house itself had tried to keep her and the world had tried to take her and both had succeeded a little. She had the Ashford signet in one hand, the silk around it damp where she'd squeezed too hard. He was looking for me, she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. Charlotte Ashford. That your real name? She closed her eyes. Yes. And the family offering the reward? My father died 6 months ago. She spoke as if unhooking herself from a line that had dragged her across galaxies. The estate is vast. I'm worth approximately $2 million in gold, land, and rights. Judd whistled softly. Money like that didn't buy happiness, but it bought enough well-lit rooms that you could mistake the absence of shadows for joy. Why did you run? Her laugh had no joy in it, only a blade. Because he promised me to James Thornfield in exchange for backing in a rail corridor. Because James collects beautiful things and breaks them slowly. Because I would rather die free than live as an elegant object. She said the name and watched for the flinch. When it came, it was small but total, the shiver that runs through a structure when a buried fault line wakes. James is my cousin, Judd said. He let the word stand and did not apologize for the shape of the world. My mother was a Thornfield before she married my father. We grew up together. I worked for him 3 years. Then I learned what he was. I threatened to expose him. He burned my name, salted my ground, and smiled the whole time. Charlotte stared at him as if someone had set down a mirror she hadn't known existed. You're related to the man I was supposed to marry. By blood, Judd said. Not by choice. They stood in a tiny living room like 2 planets calculating whether their gravities meant orbit or collision. The kettle began to scream. Judd poured water to quiet it and to give his hand something that wasn't her to hold. She took the mug and held it wrong the way nobles hold simple things, reverent and a little perplexed. "You could turn me in," she said finally, without drama. "Collect the reward. 2 million will set you up for life." "I could," he said. "Will you?" Judd looked past her to the forge, its black mouth, its banked coal. The place's metal remembers heat even after it looks cold. "When I carried you out of that snow," he said, "I didn't do it because I thought you might be worth something." He met her eyes. "I did it because you're a person who needed help. That hasn't changed." She shook her head, tears making her irises wild and bright. "You don't understand what James will do if he finds out you're keeping me." "I understand perfectly." He set the mug down, stepped closer, tilted her chin so she had to stand inside the truth of him. "I love you, Charlotte Ashford. Not your money. Not your name. You. And I'll be damned if I let James Thornfield take one more thing that matters to me." The words landed like a bridge between cliffs that had been pretending they were islands. She rose on her toes and kissed him, tasting of salt and copper and something like dawn. "I love you too," she said into his mouth, like a vow she had been saving against a day such as this. "But love might not be enough." "Then we'll make it enough," he said. A knock interrupted the vow, a small sound that carried the weight of a world. It wasn't Crawford. It was a clerk from Cheyenne Orbital in a shuttle jacket too thin for the weather, carrying a legal pouch like it might explode. He didn't look Judd in the eye, and he did look at Charlotte because he could not help it. She had the kind of presence that taught you who you were in relation to it. Judd signed. The clerk fled. Judd slit the pouch with his thumb. "Mental incompetence hearing," he read aloud, voice flat as sheet steel. "He's claiming you're unfit to manage your affairs." He turned the next page. "And me, kidnapping, extortion, corrupting a mentally incompetent woman." "They're going to hang you," Charlotte whispered, and for the first time since he'd found her she looked young. "Not if we fight back." "How do you fight a man who owns half the judges in the West system?" "You take away what he wants most." Judd's eyes were steady. The storm outside rattled the hatch, but he didn't turn. He had an anvil inside him that weather could not move. "In federal court at Cheyenne Orbital, you publicly renounce your inheritance. All of it. Pass it to the territories. Schools, clinics, roads. You remove his motivation and his case falls apart." "Judd, that's 2 million. Worth every credit," he said, "if it keeps you free." They didn't have time for ring boxes or flowers. They had the wind and the forge and a choice. That night they packed the things that mattered and some things that didn't but felt like they might someday. They ate standing, shared bread torn in the middle, finished the last of the honey. He took the fractured hoop he'd found by the fence and set it in the forge until it glowed a patient orange. He hammered and turned, quenched and tempered, coaxing a circle from a broken arc. It wasn't perfect. It was honest. On the third night of travel, when the turbines behind them looked like dark sails and the valley below sang with a stream warmed by the planet's slow heart, Charlotte drew a chain from her shirt. A signet slid into the firelight: Ashford, a phoenix, 2 spires. "Rebecca Ashford," she said, "great-grandmother, 16, nothing but a dream and a stubborn refusal to be told where the horizon was. She'd understand what we're doing." Judd offered the iron ring across the small distance the universe had left between them. "Save this," he said. "Figured it brought me the best luck of my life." "It's perfect," she said, and slid it onto her finger. He smiled because imperfect things look perfect on the right hands. "Charlotte Elizabeth Ashford," he said, feeling suddenly traditional in a wilderness that had no patience for ceremony. "Will you marry me? Not for your name or your fortune. Because I can't imagine a map that doesn't have you on it." "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times." They stood beneath a sky bruised with distant lightning and made a covenant older than law and truer than money: "This life with you, even if the world says no, even if the world burns." In the morning, They walked into the snarl of Cheyenne orbital traffic with a plan so simple it would look like madness to the kind of man who thinks complexity is cleverness. The marshal would be there. Crawford would be there. James would sit in a front row with lawyers for teeth. The AI judge, Harrison Pierce, would be there, his processors cooled by a conscience harder to bribe than flesh. Charlotte would rise in a court that had been bought and sold and say the one thing that could not be monetized, no. And all the while, the ring from the fence, once a useless scrap, now a vow, would warm to the heat of her blood, a circle hammered out of ruin. The wind would claw the edges of the station's windows. The turbines would spill silver into the sky. And in the place where two people meet the storm and refuse to bow, something that looks like luck would begin to look suspiciously like courage. Chapter 3, 4 Days Through the Wind Rim. They left at a blue hour when the turbines looked like carded wool against a paling sky. Judd moved with the sure economy of a man who had done his leaving once and learned which objects argue for space in a pack and which ones, no matter how eloquent, have to stay behind. He took water filters, med gel, spare shoes for Thunder, 9, a coil of climbing line, the ledger Charlotte had already copied to a cold wafer, and a stove pot that had seen more winters than either of them. He left the copper mug his mother used, not because it didn't matter, but because it did, and sentiment is a weight you don't carry into a chase. Charlotte closed the cabin's inner hatch and laid her palm flat to the scuffed surface like a benediction. "I'll come back different," she said softly, to the room that had held her first warm breath after the pod. "Try not to be jealous." Thunder, 9 tossed his head, silver bridle winking. Judd checked each equinoid's load and toggled the fence to dormant. He took one last look across the pale ridge sea, then pulled down a canvas shade over the forge's mouth, like closing the eyes of a sleeping giant, and nodded to Charlotte. They set off along a cut where the wind gave up fighting and slipped meekly between rocks. The first day they kept low in the channels that spidered down from the turbines to the flats, the equinoid's hooves ticking the rhythm of endurance. Midday, a glint needled the sky and multiplied, 3 dots, then 5, then a spread of matte black lozenges angling into formation. "Crawford's," Judd said. You could tell by the way they moved, like polite company at a funeral. Charlotte pulled a hand mirror from her pocket, the size of a coin, its edge scalloped as if it had belonged to a debutante on a planet with pink skies. She popped the back, adjusted a wafer-thin filter, and handed it to Judd. "Hold this over the stove's chimney," she said. "The thermal bloom will look like a stray geothermal puff. If they sample the plume they'll taste minerals instead of us." "You carry a mirror that lies," Judd said, both impressed and not, because of course she did. "It also tells the truth," she said. "It depends what you ask it for." They huddled beneath a turbine pylon while the drones combed the ridge, patient as death. One paused, tilted, and hovered so close the air tasted of battery acid. Charlotte's fingers found Judd's, not panicked, not even pleading, just present. He squeezed back, the drone drifted on. At dusk they reached a cut that dipped toward a strand of scrub and steam, the mouth of a geothermal spring singing to itself like a teapot too content to shriek. Judd set the tent, Charlotte gathered dry brush that wasn't quite dry, and they ate in the modest style of fugitives, an honest hunger made luxurious by company. "People think fear is the opposite of courage," Charlotte said, watching the spring breathe. "It isn't. It's the raw material. Metal doesn't know what it is until the hammer tells it," Judd said. "Fear's the same. You make it into something. Did he ever scare you?" "James." Judd took his time answering. The wind braided itself into the tent cords and tugged, like a playful god that could become mean. "He scared me the way a cliff does," he said. "Not because it wants to hurt me. Because it doesn't care if I fall." She was quiet a long moment. "I hate that I know exactly what you mean." They were moving at first light on day 2, thread-needling between the hills that led to a long gray flat called Mirror Field. From a distance it looked like a calm lake, up close it proved to be fused glass, sand melted by ancient lightning, cooled and cracked into plates. The equinoids minced and skated, Thunder, 9 loved it, showing off the way an athlete shows off, not to be admired but because excellence is its own kind of joy. We detour here, Charlotte said, pointing to a cluster of derelict towers far off the mapped path. Judd shaded his eyes. Old relay. My father thought the age of paper was quaint, she said. I found it practical. I cached something there the week I ran. Crawford will look at every place you'd think to go. He'll start with the places a girl would run, Charlotte said. This is a place a woman planned. They approached at an angle, then doubled back twice, then circled, letting the equinoid sense muddle the story. The relay's door had once cared who came in, now it cared not at all. Inside, dust lay like apathy. The local node AI pinged awake and peered at them with the prickly dignity of a desk clerk in a dead town. Access request, it said. Charlotte stepped forward. Override Ashford Prime Rebecca Ann. Her voice went soft and precise, the way a key goes soft and precise when it finds the right lock. The node sniffed the syllables, tasted 100-year-old authority steeped in a child's name, and inclined invisible shoulders. A panel unlatched with a sigh that felt like relief. Behind it, a leather folio wrapped in wax cloth, and a second, smaller pouch. Charlotte opened the first. Ledger pages lay within, their lines marched in careful script, their totals as damning in ink as they were in chain hashes. She opened the second. A knife gleamed, the hilt had been worn smooth by another woman's palm. Rebecca's? Judd asked. So my grandmother said. Charlotte slid it into her boot. They were almost to the door when someone knocked on it from the other side. Judd's hand went to his pistol, Charlotte's went to his arm. No shooting unless we have to, she whispered. Glass field will amplify ricochets. The door swung wide on a gentleman's apology. Crawford took off his hat as if entering a drawing room. Two men flanked him, faces blank in the way that says their lives are purchased hour by hour. Miss Ashford, Crawford said. You leave the most interesting fingerprints. Charlotte smiled, which in some women means surrender and in her meant the prelude to an attack of a more refined sort. Mr. Crawford. That is a beautiful equinoid you're straddling. Was it expensive to teach him to bow? Some animals understand status the way some people do, instinctively, Crawford said. Speaking of which, your fiancé misses you terribly. He misses very specific things, Charlotte said lightly. None of which are me. The smile coultered the air, beneath it, intent gathered density. Crawford's men shifted, subtle weight on the balls of their feet. Judd felt the day tilt toward ruin. 50,000, Hollis, Crawford said, as if they were finishing a conversation begun yesterday. You can stop walking uphill in the wind. Judd looked at Charlotte. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She met his eyes as if anchoring him to the only thing in the scene worth being tethered to. He answered Crawford without looking away from her. I work for what I have, he said. I like liking myself. Shame, Crawford murmured. He moved like weather, and the men moved with him. The room compressed to the size of a breath. Run, Charlotte said, but to the equinoids, in French, the notes so clean and quick the air flashed. Thunder, 9 launched first, smashing through the relay's far window in a rain of brittle light. The others followed, heard logic trumping fear, barefoot over glass that should have cut them but didn't because Judd had shod them for ugly ground and bad intentions. Judd fired once, not at a man but at a load-bearing bracket above Crawford's head. The beam sizzled true, the bracket screamed, a shelf of rusted relay plates tore free and crashed between them like a drawn curtain. Judd grabbed Charlotte's hand and they ran. Glass field sang when you loped across it, a melody of fractures and carries. Behind them, Crawford swore with eloquence that proved he'd learned to be a gentleman after he'd learned to be something else. Ahead, the flats trembled where weak points met, Thunder, 9 picked the steps that existed, as if the world flipped panels into place just ahead of his hooves. They made the far bank with lungs that knew their job and hearts that doubted they did. They dove into scrub, then into shadow, then into a cleft where the wind forgot them. Judd pressed his back to rock and counted to 50 without thinking about why. Charlotte pressed her fingers to her own pulse and watched it refuse to quit. They didn't stop again until dusk turned the world patient. In the lee of a fallen tower, Judd built a small, conceited fire that tried to be bigger than it should be. Charlotte cleaned a scratch along Thunder's shoulder and whispered into his mane, all vowels and kindness. "You saved us," Judd said when her hands were finally idle. "So did you." He shook his head. "I made a hole. You made a path." She looked at the ring on her finger, the one he had hammered out of wreckage, and turned it a quarter turn. "It isn't perfect," she said. "Neither are we. That's not what I meant." She smiled, eyes tired and brilliant. "I meant it knows where it came from." On day 3, the land began to lift toward the sky wire, a thin dark stitch that sewed the wind rim to Cheyenne orbital. The public cargo climber sat under armed oversight, which would have been a problem if the marshal on duty had been anyone but Morton Briggs. He watched them join the queue, 2 riders with equinoids and a pack that looked like honesty wearing a nervous mask, and said nothing. When it was their turn, he glanced at their papers, the way a man glances at the horizon to confirm it is where he remembers, and handed them back. "Wind's up," he observed. "Always is," Judd said. Briggs's gaze ticked to Charlotte's face and away again. "Small advice," he said, as if discussing weather. "The rich pay for speed because they fear time. Use time. It's cheaper." "Thank you, Marshal," Charlotte said, and meant it. The climber rose through thin air into thinner, Eolia dropping away like a story you tell a child to help them sleep. Station lights flicked on one by one as the arc of Cheyenne orbital revealed itself, a diadem hung where gravity couldn't quite remember its job. The dock smelled of ozone and starch. The press smelled blood. Cameras gathered the way gulls do around a trawler. "Head up," Judd murmured. "We walk like we belong." "We do," Charlotte said, and the words changed the shape of the hallway. By the time they reached the courthouse doors, she had become the woman who used to wear rooms the way other women wear dresses. She didn't need silk to do it now. The Ashford signet rested warm against her collarbone. The iron ring rested warmer against her skin. She put her hand on the door. "Ready?" "Don't know how to be," Judd said, and smiled. "But yes." They stepped inside together. Somewhere far below, wind moved. Somewhere close by, law stirred. Between them, 2 people made a line through a crowd that suddenly remembered what eyes were for. Chapter 4, The Day the Orbit Court Remembered What Law Is For. The sound of 100 drones holding their breath is nothing at all, and everything at once. The gallery bristled. Reporters wore their best faces, alert, serious, hungry. A woman from the Chicago String broadcast into her sleeve with the fervor of a priest transmitting a miracle. A man from San Francisco ran a live caption that outpaced his own astonishment. In the front row, James Thornfield rose, the cut of his suit so precise it appeared to be thinking for him. "Charlotte, darling," he called, just loud enough for the mics to be catching and the judge's patience not yet tried. "Thank God you're safe. We've all been so worried." Charlotte did not look at him. She crossed the aisle with the surety of a woman who has made the most expensive decision of her life already, and so finds lesser prices trivial. Judd walked a half step behind her, neither in front as a shield nor behind as a shadow, but where a vow walks. Harrison Pierce, Chief Justice of the Cheyenne Orbital Circuit, took the bench with a serenity that had no perfume of theater. Part of him was hardware cooled by deliberate thought. Part of him was flesh that remembered hay dust and payday and the first time he had watched someone smaller stand up to someone bigger. The human clerk settled, the AI clerks hummed. "Call the matter," Pierce said. The clerk did. Words piled up that had once been abstract to Judd and had become urgent through brutal repetition: mental incompetence petition, protective conservatorship, kidnapping and coercion. Pierce's gaze moved to Charlotte. "Miss Ashford, are you represented?" I represent myself, she said. With the court's permission. James's lead attorney, slick, sallow, a charisma vacuum wrapped in thread count, rose halfway. Your Honor, the petitioner objects. The subject's competency is the very question before the court. Which is why she will speak, Pierce said mildly. Sit down. A ripple of laughter did not dare become itself. The attorney sat, bleeding status. Pierce to Charlotte, proceed. She drew breath. In that breath lived a child who had been taught which fork to use and a teenager who had learned what happens to girls who laugh too loudly, and a woman who had crawled out of a broken pod and into a stranger's arms and found that stranger had a name for her she recognized, person. When she spoke, the station leaned closer. I am Charlotte Elizabeth Ashford, she said, daughter of Edmund Ashford, heir to the Ashford holdings and estates. I stand of my own free will, in clear and present mind. She glanced once at Judd, and his steady turned into hers. I have come to renounce my inheritance in full. A murmur ran through the gallery, ran into itself, became a wave that slapped against the benches and then broke and fell silent when Pierce lifted a finger. State the terms, he said. I hereby disclaim and donate all rights, claims, and titles connected to Ashford Holdings, mineral, land, orbital, and financial, to the Eolia Territorial Trust, to be used for public schools, clinics, and infrastructure in the Western Rim. Effective immediately. James was on his feet, miraculous in his own way, gravity's pet who had learned to pretend he did not answer to it. She is not competent to decide this, he snapped. She has been brainwashed by a known malcontent with a criminal history. Your Honor, we have affidavits. Sit, Pierce said again, and did not bother to make it a request. James sat, the way a storm sometimes sits, for now. Miss Ashford, the sallow attorney tried, gentling his vowels, surely you don't understand the scope. Charlotte lifted her hand and the iron ring caught a beam of court light and turned it into a lesson. I understand exactly, she said, and the way she said exactly made people remember the cost of their own choices. I understand that my father promised me like a parcel to James Thornfield in exchange for leverage on a rail corridor. I understand that Mr. Thornfield collects beautiful things and breaks them slowly. I understand that I would rather live in poverty as a person than die in luxury as property. Someone clapped once, then remembered where they were. Pierce's mouth was neutral, his eyes were not. Do you have evidence to support your allegations against Mr. Thornfield? Charlotte set the leather folio on the rail as if placing a sacrament. 3 copies, she said. Ledger pages from the Denver extraction operation. Claim jumping, worker eliminations disguised as accidents, transfers to shell entities mapped to bribe schedules for named judges. Each page authenticated by independent handwriting analysts in 3 circuits, each cross-verified against chain hashes from the internal accounting network. Addenda include recorded testimony from 2 supervisors now under union protection. One addendum includes a confession from Mr. Thornfield's first wife's groom regarding the sabotage of a saddle prior to her fatal accident. No one breathed. The gallery became a single-held lung. James laughed. It was his strongest play now, and he played it like a gambler shoving the rest of his luck at the table. Forgeries, he said. Every word. I'll have this court disbarred, I'll have this judge unplugged. The courtroom doors opened with a choreography that had been practiced in corridors and in ethics classes and in older, darker rooms where power sits smug in its chair. Union marshals entered. Morton Briggs led them. His badge looked like a promise someone had actually meant to keep. Mr. James Thornfield, Briggs said. By warrant of the Western Circuit Grand Jury, you are under arrest for murder, fraud, conspiracy, and intimidation of federal witnesses. For a second, James didn't hear the words as anything but noise. Then meaning landed. He took one step back, just one, and found that the space he had depended on always being there had been quietly filled by other people's choices. The marshals took him. His eyes looked for Charlotte and found her. This isn't over, he mouthed, because the script of men like him requires the final line to be denial. Charlotte considered him for the measured span of a single heartbeat of the person she had been. Then she moved on. Pierce accepted the folios. His human hand turned the first page with care that would have made a librarian bless him. His other hand flickered a quiet subnet. Judges can decide quickly when the groundwork has been both meticulous and inevitable. He looked up. The petition to declare Miss Ashford incompetent is denied, he said. The petition for protective conservatorship is denied with prejudice. The criminal complaints against Mr. Hollis are dismissed for cause. This court finds no evidence of kidnapping, coercion, or extortion. Miss Ashford's renunciation is accepted and recorded. The Eolia Territorial Trust will assume stewardship of the estate per statutory mandate. He paused, pinpointed Crawford in the second row with a gaze that had, in another life, taught horses not to lie. Mr. Crawford, he said levelly. Any further interference with Miss Ashford's liberty will be construed as contempt and obstruction. I trust your employer's change in circumstances will alter your itinerary. Crawford inclined his head the precise degree between insult and admiration. For the first time since meeting him, Charlotte saw something like curiosity in his eyes. He was filing away a new category of woman, she would not give him a second look to refine it. Judd felt the air change the way a blacksmith feels a quench, sudden, decisive, irrevocable. The charges that could have hung him were smoke. The wealth that had made Charlotte a prize had become a school and a clinic and a road laid through a future where children would learn to read the wind. The room's hum shifted to after. His knees wanted to give. He didn't let them. Reporters erupted as reporters do when the world makes a clean sound. Questions fanged the air. Miss Ashford, why? Mr. Hollis, were you coerced? Justice Pierce, does this set precedent for AI human benches? Charlotte answered one and then stopped. Please, she said, and the room listened because law had just happened and law makes even noisy people reverent for half a minute. Give us an hour. In the corridor, the station's windows gave them Eolia, small and fierce, turning below like a coin a god had flipped and forgotten to catch. For a moment neither spoke. When speech returned, Charlotte's voice held a light Judd had not heard before, not relief exactly, but the clean absence of a particular fear. Now what? She asked. We go home, he said. We build the life we meant. She laughed, shaky, beautiful. Simple, she said. Not easy, he corrected. But simple. They passed Briggs on the way to the docks. He nodded once, the way a man nods at a finished fence line. Good luck, he said. Luck's a horseshoe you make yourself, Judd said. Briggs's mouth tugged. So I see. Crawford waited at the turn that led to the charter platforms, his hat in his hands for once. Miss Ashford, he said. Mr. Hollis. He considered them, then the world beyond them. If I'd been paid to wager instead of to hunt, I'd have lost money today. You can always quit your job, Charlotte said, surprise and mercy making a brief treaty in her voice. I'm only expensive because I don't, he said, and tipped the hat. Watch your livestock. Judd stepped in, and the step made the corridor measure itself again. You touch my stock, and I'll teach you what integrity looks like in a smaller room. Crawford's smile acknowledged the shape of the room they were in now. Wouldn't dream of it, he said, and for the first time Judd thought perhaps he wasn't lying. They boarded a local shuttle down well, no ceremony, no escort. The window gave them back to gravity. Charlotte looked at her hands, turned the iron ring, and exhaled so slowly it sounded like a prayer being answered somewhere she would never see. Free, she said, trying the weight of the word now that it was hers to spend. Utterly free. Let's see what we buy with it, Judd said. Below them, the wind rim's turbines turned, indifferent, immense, faithful. Somewhere in the silent bright of the station, a clerk filed a thing that would make other things possible. Somewhere in a holding cell, a man realized that the one market he had never learned to work in, the heart, had closed to him forever. And in the small gravity of two people who had chosen each other against the counsel of ease, a future took on weight, ready to be hammered into shape. Chapter 5, Home, with Weather. They came down from the orbit court like two sparks returning to their crucible. Aeolia received them without ceremony, the way a place receives rain. The turbines hummed their indifferent hymn, the sky rehearsed another argument with itself. Judd toggled the fence back to life. The cabin air, when the hatch opened, smelled of iron and good ash, as if the room had been keeping their place. Charlotte stepped over the threshold and the sound she made was not a word. Relief is a language that doesn't ask permission. For a day they did nothing grand. They hauled water and laughed when it sloshed. They inventoried bolts and found 6 that didn't belong anywhere and decided to keep them for luck. They let Thunder, 9, choose his own patch of shade. They discovered that their cupboard held exactly 3 decent mugs and adopted the cracked one as their favorite because it required mindfulness. The Aeolia Territorial Trust notified them with formal gratitude and immediate questions. Charlotte read the message on the porch steps, back against the cabin wall, knees up, as if she were a student again and the world was a syllabus. They want guidance on allocations, she said. Schools first, clinics next, roads last, or the reverse. If we build roads, people can reach schools and clinics. If we build clinics, they'll live long enough to use the roads. If we build schools, they might make different choices about roads. Judd smiled. You just renounced an empire and they're already asking you to run it better. I gave it away, not up, she said. It still matters what it becomes. They visited town on the 3rd day to buy feed and salt and rumors. The feed store kept its rumors on an open shelf. A woman with a braid like a whip handle said, "That your girl, Hollis?" The one from the feeds, and didn't wait for his answer. Saw you hand a fortune to the trust. Noble, she said, like she was testing how the word fit in her mouth. Some of us might have preferred a check. Charlotte took it without flinching. Some of you will still get one, she said mildly. Just formatted as a roof and a clinic bed and a teacher with time. The woman considered, spat neatly into the dust, and handed over a sack of bran. We'll hold you to it, lady. Please do, Charlotte said, and Mean turned into ally in the space of a handshake. Word of what had happened in orbit walked faster than any equinoid. People came by the cabin with casseroles that were really questions. Is it true? Are you safe? Do the marshals know? Charlotte made tea and answered what she could. Judd stood in the doorjamb, guard and joy and proof, and watched the way a town changes direction because one person shows it where to stand. The first trouble arrived on cat feet and left on a siren. 2 days after their return, Judd found the water line split just past the east fence, the rupture too clean for weather. He knelt in the wet sand and pressed his fingers into the cut, the way a smith reads a blade. Not a rock, he said. Crawford? Charlotte asked. Or admirers of his employer, Judd said. He's too professional to nick a pipe for sport. They fixed it the way poor saints fix holy things, with care and a lack of drama. They buried the joint deep and left a censer bead that would sing if anyone came whispering. That night, they barred the hatch and made the kind of love that confirms, not distracts. After, Judd lay with his palm against Charlotte's belly, not because a child was there yet but because the place existed and possibility is a sacrament. Morning brought Marshal Briggs, which was either reassurance or foreboding depending on whether you looked at his badge or his boots. He sat on the porch step like a man about to whittle something and forgot his knife. Congratulations, he said. You made national feeds. Also enemies. We noticed, Judd said. Thornfield's board has lawyers who can live a year on a comma, Briggs went on. They'll try for injunctions to freeze the trust. Not likely to stick. Pierce is clean and has friends. But there are other tactics. Breaking things. Hiring people who like to make the inside of a barn look like the end of the world. Charlotte poured him coffee. Crawford? Briggs shrugged one shoulder. He hires out, but not to amateurs. If he comes, it will be to talk. If others come, it will be to light matches. Good to know, Judd said. Briggs rose, dusted his palms. Use neighbors. You gave them a school. Let them give you a watch. He left with the sound of a man who has done the arithmetic of his day. Judd and Charlotte looked at each other and then toward the right-hand ridge where the wind gets teeth in storm season. They strung bells along the fence line and tuned them, because sound can be a weapon or a welcome depending on intent. They walked the perimeters with thunder, mapping weakness with their feet. They placed mirrors at odd angles in the scrub to catch unwanted movement and turn it into sunlight. At dusk, a boy from the relay hamlet came loping, hair in his eyes and virtue all elbows. Mr. Hollis, he panted. Miss Ashford. A man in town says to tell you his hat tips east. I dunno what it means. Charlotte smiled like she had just solved a riddle she'd written herself. It means he'll come by at sunrise, she said. And that he hopes we won't point a gun at his horse. Do we? The boy asked, honest as a bucket. We'll see, Judd said, and flicked the boy a coin for candy and a story to tell. They slept with one ear open. The wind changed shift 2 hours before dawn and the bells on the north line chimed once, then held their breath. Judd slid out of the bed and into his boots. Charlotte's eyes were open in the dark, she nodded. He stepped out with the kind of caution that has grace in it. Silas Crawford sat his equinoid on the far side of the fence, hat brim low, posture impeccable. He waited until Judd was close enough to hear a civilized voice. May I come in? He asked. Or will the bells summon a shooting gallery? You can talk there, Judd said. Crawford acquiesced, which taught Judd everything he needed to know about how this conversation would go. 2 nights from now, Crawford said, a crew out of Laram will take a contract to confirm your mortality. They prefer fire. It's narratively satisfying and hard to prosecute. They'll start with your barn and encourage you to make mistakes. Why warn us? Charlotte asked from the doorway. Her voice held zero fear and a dash of interest, like a woman contemplating a recipe she has time to master. Professional courtesy, Crawford said. Mr. Thornfield is currently indisposed, but resentment accrues interest. His board wishes to demonstrate continuity of vision. And your fee? Judd asked. A favor claimed later, Crawford said. Small. But it is a favor. I prefer to collect from people with the unimpeachable vice of honoring their word. What's to stop you from telling them you warned us and collecting from them too? Judd said. My reputation, Crawford said simply. I work for many kinds of men. I offer my word only when I can afford to keep it. Judd held his gaze. It was like looking at a blade and deciding you would use it if you had to. We'll be ready, he said. Crawford touched his hat. Then I wish you a boring week. He left soundlessly, which meant he had meant it. Judd turned to Charlotte. Neighbors, he said. She was already halfway to the comm set. By noon the next day, 6 men and 5 women who had celebrated the trust with skepticism were walking their fence lines like they were drawing a map into being. The braid-handled feed woman came with 2 sons and a shotgun as old as the moon. A preacher from the South Cut brought coffee with more endurance than doctrine. Briggs returned, unofficial, and installed himself at the bend in the road where he would have plausible deniability and a superior view. At dusk, Charlotte stood in the barn and put her hand flat to Thunder's flank. If I ask, will you forgive me, she whispered, and the equinoid swung his bright head and blew approval across her wrist. They staged the place like a story for an enemy who reads pictures but not people. Heat decoys in the hay. Mirrors to multiply silhouettes. Tripwire that didn't trip anything but bells strung to sing low and a register that says a thing you can't ignore without feeling it later. Judd rigged the forge vent to draw like a lung and belch smoke as if it were a fire-finding greed. He walked through the plan with Charlotte twice, then a third time at her insistence because clarity is mercy when chaos arrives. They slept an hour at sunset. It felt like stealing. When the bells sang, it wasn't pretty. Pretty is for spring. This was a warning made of iron. Judd rose and became the kind of calm he learned at the anvil. Charlotte placed herself where the worst would become manageable. The first bottle broke against the barn's south wall and flame ran wet, hunting edges. A second shattered near the decoys and the forge vent drank greedily and exhaled panic, as arranged. 3 figures in gray moved in the lee of the low fence, careful, competent, paid enough to know the cost of failure but not enough to choose a different life. Now, Charlotte said, and the mirrors kicked moonlight into their eyes. Thunder screamed, a magnificent, terrifying sound, and the herd surged not forward but sideways, as trained, collapsing the intruder's angles. Judd fired twice to frighten, not kill, and the preacher's coffee went to good use as a deluge over the first fire line. The feed woman's older boy cut an arsonist off at the knees with a well-placed tackle that would have made a rugby god proud if rugby gods watched Eolia. One of the gray men swung toward Charlotte, and time did that elastic thing it does when fear becomes a hammer. She didn't retreat. She lifted the old knife from her boot, Rebecca's, and held it in the way a woman holds a promise she intends to keep. He paused, because history was looking at him through her eyes, and in that breath Briggs materialized, badge a cold star. Drop, he said, and this time drop did not require a gavel. It took 15 minutes to end. It took an hour to be sure. It took all night to come down from it. When the last ember surrendered, Charlotte leaned her forehead to Thunder's neck and shook like a woman who has earned it. Judd stood with the knife in his hand for a long time after she gave it to him, and then he slid it back into her boot and kissed the place above it. "You were very brave," the preacher said, and Charlotte made a face. "I was very angry," she said. "I'm tired of men who think fire is an argument." "It is," the preacher said. "So is water. We used both." Briggs took statements, dry as biscuits, and promised the Greys would be booked and labeled properly so their employers wouldn't be able to buy them out of consequences with a signing bonus. He looked at the barn, singed but standing. He looked at the ring on Charlotte's finger and Judd's hand on her shoulder. "They'll try letters next," he said. "Ugly ones. Meant to cut where fire didn't." "I have a forge," Judd said. "I have a better knife," Charlotte said. Briggs permitted himself a human fraction of a smile. "And neighbors," he said, and rode into a sunrise that had rightfully belonged to them all along. They went to bed when the sun was already up. They slept like people whose bodies remember cavalry charges and whose minds find them less impressive. They woke to a morning that had not decided whether to be ordinary or holy and decided for it, both. Later, when the men who had meant to burn their life to the ground asked why the plan had failed, one would say, they weren't alone. Another would say, the woman looked at me like I was a footnote, and I realized I was. Neither would mention the bells or the mirrors or the way a ring hammered from wreckage can change the weather of a person's fate. Some things aren't for reports. Chapter 6, The Night of the Red Storm. The sky went iron 3 days later. Off to the west, a welding line of light etched the horizon, storm season arriving with contempt for schedules. The meteorologists whose instruments ringed the ridge, 3 graduate students and a widow with a genius for wind, called it a red storm, the kind some planets name and some pray at. On Eolia, you latched the shutters and pretended you believed in luck. Judd hinged reinforcement plates over the south windows. Charlotte doused the lamps that didn't need to burn and lit the ones that did because light is information and theater if you arrange it right. They moved past each other in the practiced grace of a couple whose choreography has traded spectacle for trust. "Whatever comes, we have enough," Judd said. "We do," Charlotte agreed. She meant water, staples, courage, and the memory of hands on her back when the barn flared. She meant neighbors who now knocked on the door before walking in. She meant a body that had started feeling slightly seasick in the mornings and was not concerned. By dusk, the wind had a voice. By full dark, it had an opinion. The turbines leaned into it like men shouldering a stubborn thing across a field. Static crawled across the glassware like spiders. Out by the barn, thunder stomped and stilled, listening not with ears but with bone. Letters arrived the way Briggs promised they would, one typed, one handwritten, one printed crude with ink still tacky. Charlotte didn't read them, not because she was afraid of their contents but because she was bored by the form. "The last tools cowards try are words," she said, and fed them to the stove. Fire accepted. Judd saluted. Night thickened. The storm line hit the ridge like cavalry. Silica lifted and flew sideways. Lightning stitched a new seam in the sky. The cabin's roof, which had never begrudged its work, creaked like an old friend on a bad knee and kept at it anyway. A ping at the console cut through wind and memory. Charlotte crossed the room, steadied the screen with her hand as if the storm might jolt the pixels out of place. The message had no sender in the way a mask has no face. It was text and a shaky vid from a prison ward in the Denver complex, James Thornfield on a bench under blue light, a bruise new as gossip on his cheekbone, a smile middle school cruel. "Charlotte," he said, calm as an after-dinner drink. "I'm told magnanimity is fashionable. Consider this my gift, a truth you can't metabolize. The men who came to warm your rafters. Board members are replaceable. Hatred isn't. I will outlast your charity. I own the part of you that checks the locks twice. I own your third thought in the night. You freed yourself. Cute. Freedom is the one thing money buys cheaply." He leaned close, the lens drunk on his certainty. "Say my name every time you hear the wind. It will oblige me." Judd was beside her before he knew he'd moved. He watched until he had catalogued the weakness in James's jaw, the tiny tell where pain had layered over pride, and then he clicked the message off. "Not tonight," he said, to the man and the storm, and put his hand over Charlotte's on the console. The console hummed like a cat that knew who fed it. Lightning found the ground near the north fence and forgot to leave. The ark crawled along a buried line, latched to a sensor, burrowed into a junction box, and set a silent fire that would have grown into a loud one if the bells hadn't told their old story and if Judd hadn't believed them. He ran. Charlotte ran after him because partnerships are an invention made to be used. The junction box spit orange tongues. Judd popped the panel and punched the power cut with a bluntness that would have made an electrician write a stern letter and a poet blush. Charlotte dumped the sand bin with the inevitability of gravity. The fire died like a rumor faced with fact. By the time they stumbled back inside, the kind of tired that makes laughing sound like crying, Crawford was on the porch, ridiculous in a storm coat that made him look like a hero in an old studio epic. He did not expect to be invited in and was not. He spoke through the crack of the door as if it were a perfectly normal width for conversation. "Your friend James sent a broadcast," he said. "My clients asked me to forward it. Which I have, in a sense." "We saw it," Judd said. "Then you also saw a foolish man who believes fear is a subscription service," Crawford said. "You can cancel." "Why are you here?" Charlotte asked. Crawford considered the honest answer and found it amusingly immodest. "Storms loosen things," he said finally. "Sometimes consciences. Sometimes fence posts. I came to see which." "Both, it turns out," Judd said. "We're good." "You are," Crawford said, and then, because the wind had sanded off whatever parts of him had not already been smoothed by work, he added, "You two make my job boring. I find I don't mind." The porch shook. The barn shuddered. A gust hit the cabin broadside and then let go, as if it had mistaken them for something breakable and apologized when it realized it was wrong. "Go home, Mr. Crawford," Charlotte said. "Or wherever men like you sleep when weather gets loud." He tipped his hat and did the impolite thing of grinning back at both of them. "Try not to die," he said, which for him was tenderness, and vanished into a red curtain of grit. The storm blunted around midnight, the way some arguments do when their point has been made to everyone's satisfaction. The turbines relaxed into a satisfied hum. Rain, not much, not generous, but rain, ticked the roof. They lay back down fully dressed and let their bodies reassemble. Charlotte put Judd's hand on her belly again and left it there. "Are we foolish?" she asked the ceiling. "Every happy person is foolish to someone," Judd said. "I'm fine with their opinion." "I wasn't asking their opinion," she said, and turned to fit herself along him like a sentence finding its grammar. "I was asking yours." He traced the ring with his thumb. "I have the sense to be happy," he said. "That's either wisdom or stupidity. Either way, I want more." She laughed into his throat, the sound a small, private storm. "More," she said. "Agreed." Morning came butter yellow, that fragile mercy planets occasionally remember to offer. The gullies had new water. The air tasted like a promise not yet reneged on. The fence line held. The bells hung quiet, like saints who had done their duty and retired to contemplate groceries. Thunder, 9 pranced as if he had invented weather. They walked the perimeter together, not because they feared what they'd find but because they wanted to see with their own eyes the stubbornness of their home. The junction box was a scorched scold. The barn bore a new scar and wore it handsomely. Beyond the north ridge, you could see where lightning had smelted a sheet of sand into glass. Charlotte squatted and touched it with 2 fingers, reverent. "We should cut a tile," Judd said. "Set it by the door." "For luck?" she asked. "For memory," he said. "We won." She looked up at him, hair blown into plans. "No," she corrected gently. "We chose." He nodded, corrected. "We chose." That afternoon, the meteorologists came by with charts and courage and a pie. The feed woman brought apologies for her skepticism in the form of stew. Briggs sent a 1-line message, letter sender relocated to a cell. "Enjoy your weather." Crawford sent nothing at all, which was articulate. They washed the storm out of their clothes and kept the weather in their bones. They sat on the porch steps the way they had the first day back from Orbit Court and flipped through the trust's proposals with quiet concentration. "Clinic roof first," Charlotte said. "Then the school's heating coils. Then the road." Judd tapped the page with a blackened thumbnail. "Road last, like you wanted," he teased. She shrugged, unashamed. "I like changing my mind when it learns something." He watched the wind draw maps no one had charted yet. "We'll have to tell people," he said. "They'll want a meeting." "Good," she said. "We'll ask the kids where to put the windows. They always know where light should go." Near sundown, when the sky softened to the color of a favorite bruise, Charlotte's stomach rolled in a way that was neither illness nor fear. She sat very still until the sensation resolved into a certainty older than planets. She took Judd's hand and placed it where she had placed it so many times in imagination purely for practice. "This time," she said, "there's a reason." He didn't breathe for the span of 3 heartbeats that weren't his. Then he did, and in the breath was a man who had been alone and a man who no longer was and a father who had not yet met himself and already liked who he was becoming. "Hello," he said to his hand and to the future. "We've been waiting for you." Thunder, 9 snorted as if to say he had known all along. The turbines kept turning because that is what faithful machines do. The glass tile by the door cooled in the evening breeze. And the weather, inside and out, settled into a pattern that would hold, not because the wind had grown kinder, but because 2 people had learned how to stand in it without bending their heads. Chapter 7, Lady of the Horseshoe. Eolia doesn't do seasons so much as moods, but even a moody world will keep a calendar if you teach it with enough bells and roads. By the time the lambent months rolled around, the clinic roof no longer leaked, the school's coils kept the classrooms honest, and the road, laid last, as promised, stitched the hamlets together like a healed scar you're proud to show. Charlotte learned to carry a ledger in one hand and a saddle blanket in the other. In the morning she met with the Territorial Trust crew over a cracked table that smelled like coffee and graphite, moving figures between columns as if they were sheep needing better pasture. By midday she had dust on her boots from the training ring, murmuring to skittish yearlings in French and in kindness. In the evening she walked the fence with Judd, silver bells flicking their soft questions, and answered yes to each one. People who had been wary of the woman who gave away an empire began to stop using the word miracle and started using the word neighbor. The braid-handled feed woman, whose name turned out to be Eliza Garrow, leaned her elbows on her counter one day and announced, "You were right about windows. The kids wanted them low enough to see the world and high enough to dream." "Children are good architects," Charlotte said, paying for salt and smiling at how quickly yes had become the currency she spent most and least lightly. The moniker started as a joke at the relay, Lady of the Horseshoe, scrawled on a chalkboard at the end of the bar, and became, like some jokes do, a title everybody meant. It came partly from the ring hammered out of a broken hoop and partly from the luck that seemed to slot into place around her presence. Neighbors brought equinoids with infections that had names and ones with hurts that didn't. She treated both. Couples came arguing about fences and left arguing about recipes. There was a week when 4 babies arrived. She swore it was the clinic's better lighting and not the new midwife 3 ridges over. Judd didn't argue. He built a cradle and pretended he'd always known how. He was becoming a man who made ironware that never failed, hinges that refused to squeal, a stove door that closed with a kiss. Word of his quiet competence walked the road and knocked for itself. He forged shoes for equinoids that had opinions, repaired turbine braces for farmers who didn't trust bolts they hadn't watched being born, and taught a boy who hid his stutter in grease and became fluent when his hands were busy. There were tests. The letters didn't stop, but they lost their edge when people who wrote them discovered that written malice burns cleaner than it lands. A contract crew from the Laram Fringe tried to goose the trust into hiring cousins at premium. Charlotte's eyebrow did the work of a sermon. 2 men with polished boots and dull eyes came to buy the cabin at a price that assumed hunger. Judd asked if they needed water for the long walk home and shut the door. Crawford didn't collect his favor for months, which is how you know it mattered. He announced himself with a hat hung over the fence post like a white flag and waited until Judd came out and flicked a pebble toward it in greeting. "Look at that," Crawford said, retrieving both hat and pebble with courtly economy. "No fires, no fists, no clerks. I begin to suspect this moon is bad for business." "You came to retire?" Judd asked. "I came to ask a small thing that will not put you at odds with your conscience," Crawford said, which was the sort of sentence you don't say unless you know it's true. "There is a mare at a lab on the northern ridge. She is an equinoid by design and a horse by temperament. The lab closed on a Friday the way cruel places do. I would like to place her with someone who will teach her the difference between fear and wind." "Bring her," Charlotte said from the porch, as if she'd been part of the conversation all along. "She can convalesce with Thunder and tell him what she thinks of his ego." Crawford smiled like a man who has a theory about redemption and pretends he doesn't. He returned 2 days later with the mare, a tall, weary beauty with a scar where a sensor had been ripped out by a hand that did not care to be careful. Charlotte stood in the pen, palms out, and let the mare decide. The decision took 5 minutes and a lifetime. By dusk the mare ate from Charlotte's cupped hands. By morning she had learned that the fence bells mean, someone is coming, and not, run. "Her name?" Judd asked. Charlotte considered. "Rebecca's Folly," she said, and then softened it with a smile. "Bex." Crawford claimed he had a schedule, which might have been true. Before he left, he watched Charlotte fit a new shoe to Bex's left fore and said, almost idly, "James Thornfield lost his appeal. His board found a new way to hate us." Judd asked. "They're diversifying," Crawford said. "It keeps them fit." "Thank you for the mare," Charlotte said, and Crawford tipped his hat because some favors pay you twice if you let them. By the time summer resolved into a brighter wind, Charlotte grew heavier in a way that made strangers smile and old women bossy. Judd discovered that a crib needs sanding 5 more times than you think it does. Thunder, 9 became impatient with lesser concerns and stood guard over the yard as if he had invented vigilance. At night, when the turbines thrummed and the stove sighed, Charlotte lay on her back and watched her belly lift as if the baby were trying to nudge the moon closer. Judd placed his hand there like a priest delivering a homily to a congregation of one. News of James came on a morning so clean it felt staged. Eliza Garrow arrived without preamble, set a basket on the table, and said, "It's in the feeds. Thornfield's dead." "How?" Charlotte asked, not because she needed pictures but because she owed the past a line. "Pride," Eliza said. "And a blade. A quarrel over a game in the yard. Prison pride is the most expensive kind." Charlotte sat, then didn't, then laughed once at the body's tendency to do what it pleases when the heart is busy. Judd watched her face like a map and didn't try to draw a route for her. "I should feel something," she said finally. "Relief, maybe. Or sadness. Or triumph. Something teachable." "What do you feel?" he asked. "Free," she said, and there it was, the word minted fresh again. Completely, utterly free. They walked the ridge that evening, Bex pacing amiably behind them, Thunder flicking his tail with proprietary satisfaction. The clinic's chimneys wrote soft sentences into the sky. The school's windows glowed the way windows glow when they were placed by children. Down valley, the road carried a boy on a bike so triumphant he might as well have been riding a comet. "Do you ever regret it?" Judd asked, not fishing, he already knew, but offering the question as a place to set something heavy, if she wanted. "Giving it away." She looked at him sideways, the iron ring bright, the signet dark against her throat. "James was right about one thing, I am the richest woman in the West. I just found my fortune somewhere he never looked." They came home to a porch step cooling in the lavender hour. The glass tile by the door threw back the sky's last color. Charlotte touched its slick surface with 2 fingers. "We should tell our child about storms the way we talk about grandparents," she said. "With respect and humor. With recipes." Judd kissed the crown of her head and felt the future line up like tools on a cloth. "We will," he said. "And about horseshoes." "Horseshoes," she teased. "Circles hammered out of wreck," he said. "Luck you make yourself." When labor came, it didn't ask for permission or poetry. It came like weather, inconvenient, absolute, and finally, cooperative. Eliza held Charlotte's hand and told filthy jokes. The new midwife, who wore her hair in a cloud and her competence like armor, did what needed doing with the calm of a woman who had coerced life to stick around more times than statistics approve. Judd learned the names of muscles he had never thanked before. Thunder, 9 suffered in the yard like a father who couldn't get into the delivery room and wanted to file a complaint with God. Then a cry like a door opening into summer. Then a body lifted to a breast. Then the kind of quiet that pours gold into a room. "She's perfect," Eliza announced, because some truths are democratic. "Rebecca," Charlotte whispered, and then, embarrassed by sentiment, grinned. "No. Not a burden. Not a monument. Eolia." Judd held his daughter in hands that had hammered ring and hinge and justice, and tried the name. It fit in his mouth like a promise. "Hello, Eolia," he said. "Welcome to the wind." They slept in shifts for a week and didn't care. People came and went with casseroles and stories and offers of watch duty they no longer needed but still scheduled because community is a habit you don't break. Crawford sent a ribbon, inappropriate and perfect. Briggs sent a note in handwriting so careful it looked like a confession, "May your weather be interesting and survivable." Pierce sent nothing, which felt right, he had already written his blessing into the record. On the first evening that wasn't triage, Charlotte stood with Eolia in her arms on the porch and asked the dark a question she didn't need answered. "Who am I now?" The wind thought about it, found it easy. A person. A mother. A woman who chose. The bells on the fence said yes. The turbine said keep going. Her daughter said milk, which is how profits start. Judd leaned in the doorway with a grin that thought it was subtle and wasn't. "Lady of the Horseshoe," he said. She rolled her eyes and kissed him like the wind had given them permission. "Fine," she said. "As long as the title comes with chores." "It does," he said, and swung the door wide. Chapter 8, Horseshoes and Heartbeats. The first year with a child teaches you the geometry of love, how a circle stretches to include a new center and somehow becomes more circular. Eolia discovered this quietly. She came home to a place that had been waiting for her, bells tuned to her first laugh, a cradle that already knew her weight, a stallion who regarded her with suspicion for 3 days and then promoted himself to guardian without pay. Charlotte learned the schedule of a moon measured in ounces and eyelids. At sunrise, she brewed coffee one-handed and read trust proposals with a sleeping baby pressed to her collarbone, the signet cool against warm skin. Mid-morning, she put Eolia's tiny palm on Thunder's nose and told him solemnly that this was his boss. He sneezed and pretended it was a salute. At noon, she drilled the interns on supply chain ethics, lactation not interrupting excellence. In the afternoon, she taught Bex to lower her head so a toddler could someday place a crown of weeds between her ears. At night, she fell into sleep like a woman whose body had run out of nouns and was asking adjectives to pick up a shift. Judd discovered a new craft, the making of hours out of minutes. He learned to fold cloth without waking a saint. He fitted a tiny glove, then two, as if the fingers might decide to argue about which hand was theirs. He hammered late at the forge, the ring on his own finger catching emberlight, and made a set of wind chimes tuned to the key of his daughter's laugh. "That's not how physics works," a neighbor teased. "Watch me," he said, and hung them where the porch can make its own weather. Briggs came by once a month and pretended the visits were coincidental. He brought news that the worst of the board's injunctions had died in committee and the lesser worsts had been strangled by procedure. "You bored them into moving on," he told Charlotte. "It's my favorite way to win." Crawford appeared twice. The first time he rode Bex, made a performance of the mare's improvement, and delivered a favor in return for a favor, a list of contractors who no longer wanted to work for employers who scorched and ran. "The world is full of good men who haven't been hired yet," he said. Charlotte gave the list to the trust and met 3 foremen who could build a bridge on time and on budget, and one who could do it with jokes. The second time Crawford asked to sit with the baby. He did it with care, as if he knew the request was perhaps the most expensive ask a man like him could make. Charlotte watched him for a long time in a silence that didn't blink. Then she placed Eolia in his arms. He held her exactly right, elbows under, eyes level, voice pitched to whatever frequency nerve and storm obey. The equinoids grazed politely, Thunder grunted once and let the moment stand. "Your line will be difficult to rob," Crawford said mildly. "It has practice," Charlotte said. After he left, Judd found the iron ring on the mantel, the one he'd hammered from the broken hoop, and polished it with the hem of his shirt. "It was always perfect," Charlotte told him. "It was honest," he said. "Perfect is for museum glass. Honest is for kitchens," she said, and slid the ring back on like a hand finding its glove. The trust put up the road sign a few weeks later, plain and clean, Hollis Forge and Stables, training by appointment, no jerks. Eliza insisted on the last part. "It's policy," she said. "And mission statement." On a day that remembered summer, the school hosted a window ceremony. The children who had drawn the plans brought chalk and drew squares on the dirt, then stood inside them and declared what each window saw: "My mama at the clinic." "The comet that's not a comet but a station light." "Thunder's tail." The adults pretended they weren't crying. Charlotte did not pretend. Judd held Eolia high so she could slap both hands on the glass and leave prints like punctuation. That night, after the last neighbor had left and the last dish had admitted defeat and the world had decided to forgive them their unfinished chores, Charlotte took Judd's hand and led him to the porch steps where so many of their decisions had been discussed into being. "Tell me the story," she said. "You've heard it 100 times," he said, settling with his shoulder to the frame, their daughter heavy with sleep against his chest. "Tell me anyway," she said, because some stories are a well, you go to them for water, not surprise. He cleared his throat and began, voice taking on the cadence that had become the family's liturgy. It started with a horseshoe, cracked and rimmed in ice, lying crooked in the snow just past the north fence. He talked about the wind that thieved breath, about a pod cracked like an egg where the cold had used up all its malice and left her for dead, about a cabin that learned the shape of a new person and decided to be larger. He talked about tea and half-truths and the day a storm taught a stallion to obey French. He talked about a signet hidden in silk, and a marshal who could tell the difference between law and theater, and a hunter whose hat tipped east when his conscience did. He talked about a court that remembered what law is for, and a judge whose human hand turned a page like it might burn him and he trusted it not to. He talked about a renunciation that cost everything and purchased the only thing worth buying, a life that belongs to you. He talked about letters and bells and fire that insisted it had the last word and then learned that water talks back. He talked about a red storm and a message that had the shape of a curse and the weight of a man who never learned what love is not for. He did not linger there. He talked about a mare called Bex and a man called Briggs and a woman called Eliza who invented a stew that could stop a war. He talked about a child named for a moon and a ring made from wreckage and a tile of glass that caught the sky and held it without breaking. He spoke in straight lines and circles, the way good stories move when they are trying to be both true and kind. When he finished, the wind did something clever with the bells and the chimes and the turbine sleep song, and for a moment everything harmonized so purely it felt like the planet was agreeing. Charlotte looked out over the ridge where the road shone faint as a vein and the clinic windows blinked their slow semaphore. "Do you ever miss the fortune?" she asked, because the story requires the question even when the answer is a foregone conclusion. Judd shifted Eolia against him and she snored lightly, unconcerned with inheritance law. "I'm holding it," he said. She smiled. "Me too." They watched the last of the light pour itself into the mountains until the shapes turned from bronze to myth. Thunder, Nine nickered once as if to call roll, Bex flicked an ear to say present. In the valley, somebody laughed loud enough to be forgiven for it. In the cabin, the stove ticked as it cooled. The ring on Charlotte's finger warmed to the pulse that never got tired of being counted. Sometimes the most valuable things refuse to be added up. Sometimes they are measured in horseshoes and heartbeats, in morning coffee shared over a table that has learned more theology than you have, in the promise of a child who will be taught the difference between fear and wind, property and person, storm and weather. The bells whispered yes. The wind thought of something else to do and did it far away. The moon came up like a coin you don't spend because it's lucky. If this story lit a spark in you, help the wind carry it. Please like, subscribe, and drop a short comment for Sci-Fi Nebula.